You can find your seat. She can start.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for attending this session, and more generally speaking, for attending this health symposium. I consider myself a friend of People's Community Clinic. A lot of the colleagues here, Kenda, Dr. Neville, and others, we've had a chance to get to know each other over the last 3 or 4 years or so. And with the pandemic, obviously, sort of thinking about the sort of health kinds of crises that we've all experienced and gone through. But in particular, Peoples does a lot of important work with youth-oriented populations. They have a youth advisory council here that they work with, and they get input from them, which I found to be a really sort of refreshing idea and concept in terms of just making assumptions about young people, their health needs and aspirations. Why not bring them in, incorporate them into kind of the process here, the experience here, and get their perspective, which might inform how they deliver care and support to the young patients that they serve here. My name is Craig Watkins. I am a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Moody College of Communication, and also the director of the IC² Institute. We do a lot of research around the intersection between technology, innovation, and the health care space in particular. And I'll kind of make some introductory remarks, but we're going to make this more of a kind of a conversation between the panelists. And so what I'd like to do is just have each of you maybe share your name, your affiliation, and anything else you might want to share with the audience about your own interests or passions as it relates to young people, adolescents, and health.
Awesome. Hey guys, I'm Apsley, and I'm a senior at UT Austin studying neuroscience. I'm an aspiring neuroscientist. I'm getting my PhD this fall in neuroscience, which I'm really excited for. I know Dr. Watkins through our work through Good Systems at UT, which is this grand challenge, this grand research project to essentially, as he said, incorporate technology, address disparate impacts of technology in healthcare specifically. I'm really excited to be talking more about adolescent health.
Hi, I'm Isaac. I am a freshman at McAllen High School. I know about this program through his mom. And I'm just excited to learn more about my healthcare options and everything that has to do with this institution.
I'm Cyrus. I'm a freshman at LBJ. As you know, he's my friend. I'm really passionate about getting $100 out of this.
Yeah. We didn't hear about that part.
Hi, my name is Detler. I am a junior at the government department at UT Austin, and I'm also a young advocate with Young Invincibles. And I'm interested in hearing about how social media can be more accessible in healthcare.
So that gives you a bit of kind of who we are, and so what we'll do is we'll kind of just start with some general observations, and then we have some prompts here. So this particular session is around adolescents and how they use social media to sort of facilitate their own interest in health-related matters, and so this is something that I think is really important to people's, insofar as understanding young people's relationship to social media, obviously, right, is a gateway into understanding their relationship to the broader society, given how critical social media is in terms of how they navigate both the information and social world around them. I thought it might be useful if I just maybe shared just a few kind of broad data trends and patterns as it relates to young people's engagement with social media. The really good thing about having two UT undergraduates here and then 2 high school students here is that they're really the experts. So what I say to you, please take with a grain of salt, and my friends who are on the panel. will offer any corrections that may be appropriate. But just for a little bit of context, and so I've been studying social media for, I'd say, probably at least since the 2010s. Obviously, social media sort of predated that period, but that's really right when the platform Facebook began to take off. Things like, if you remember, Friendster. I'll still occasionally ask undergraduate students, ever heard of MySpace? And some will actually raise their hands and say that they experimented with MySpace. But there obviously has been a significant sort of transformation in terms of just the presence of social media, the sort of technological functions and capacities of social media platforms, and probably more importantly, right, just adoption, diffusion, that is to say, the ways in which the technology has spread throughout the culture. What I've always been interested in, right, is the extent to which young people have been kind of early sort of adopters, pioneers, sort of experimenters with social media, sometimes for the good, sometimes not so much for the good. But nevertheless, right, fearless, ready to be early adopters, ready to explore this world. And that's kind of where I've done at least some of my early research kind of in this space. So what are some things that we know? We know that increasingly social media use is happening at younger and younger ages. So I'll be interested to hear, for example, when some of you began to start using social media. But I'm basing a lot of what I'll share with you on Common Sense Media. Some of you may be familiar with Common Sense, based out in the Bay Area, out in California. But they and some of my friends and colleagues there do periodic sort of national surveys of young people in terms of their engagement and use of social media. And they break it down, I think, between ages 8 to 12 and then 13 to 18. So children and then sort of young teens. And what their research suggests, and this is also consistent with other research that I've done, the Pew Research Center has done similar kinds of surveying over the last 10 and a half years or so, similarly. But there's a really interesting sort of pivot from that 8 to 12 to 13 to 18. And what we know with that older group, 13 to 18, is that the use of social media increases pretty significantly in terms of the amount of time that they're spending with social media, but also motivations, right? What draws them to social media, the range of things that they began to experiment with in terms of social media. We know that 13 to 18 transition is also a really critical period in terms of their identity formation, establishing greater autonomy from their parents and other adult figures in their lives. And so social media becomes one of the ways in which they sort of mediate that transition as they move from young child to early teens and adolescence. We also know that there's some interesting sort of distinctions between how young boys and girls use social media. Historically, much of the data has suggested that young girls are a little bit more active with social media than their teenage boy counterparts. They both use it, but teenage girls seem to be a little bit more active, spending more time with it, engaged with more platforms, for example, versus, for example, teen boys spending more time with video games, as another example. Something that surprised me, and this was the most recent report by Common Sense, is that online video among 13 to 18-year-olds is really popular, even more so, right, than maybe Instagram or Twitter. TikTok, I'm not quite sure. That TikTok, obviously, right, the use of TikTok has surged over the last 2 years or so, to the point now, right, where the U.S. government is considering trying to ban it for a lot of reasons that we won't get into here tonight. But it just sort of speaks to, again, the proliferation of the platforms, the deeper engagement that young people are experiencing with these platforms. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, Mike, is in terms of the race and ethnic makeup of young people and their engagement with social media. We know, for example, that young people of color tend to spend a little bit more time on social media platforms than their white counterparts. And youth from lower income circumstances also tend to spend a little bit more time with social media than their more middle class or upper income counterparts. There are kinds of sociological and historical reasons for that we don't have to get into tonight. But again, it's just a way of sort of understanding the broader context that we might keep in the back of our minds as we have this conversation. And then finally, the other thing that I'll add here is it seems like, right, the motivations for using social media also change, right? And not surprisingly, right, 8 to 12, your motivations, your interests, your understanding of the world, yourself in relationship with the world is very different than, say, for example, 13 to 18. So as you become more aware of the external world, as you begin to start investing in your own identity, your own relationships, social media becomes really important in that regard. And so I think that in some ways sort of helps us to understand why there's a significant rise in just the amount of time and frequency of engaging with social media in that 13 to 18-year-old age sort of window, if you will. And so those are just some general snapshots that Common Sense and other organizations that have made it kind of part of their business and part of their investment in youth and adolescent sort of health and well-being to understand, right, their sort of deep engagement with technologies, with media of all kind, certainly social media. I'll stop there and just sort of open it up, and maybe if you have some thoughts or responses to anything that I've said, any statistics that maybe don't ring or resonate with you want to offer a counterpoint, please feel free. Again, I consider you just as much an expert in this space as I am, so I'll do that. Any thoughts or reactions to anything you've heard so far?
Sure. I guess I'll just kind of like open up the floor to you guys and anyone else that like wants to pitch in about what do you guys think is the most significant like cognitive impact of long-term social media use for the current generation? Because I believe for our generation, which is Gen Z, we kind of grew up at the start of the digital age, but then we didn't really become attuned to regular social media use until maybe our preteens. But now children are getting access to that content at a far much younger age. So what do you guys think are the implications for development and for mental health in kids?
Personally, I mean, I don't mean this in a bad way. The college students here feel old to us almost because I mean we grew up in an age where social media was just so prevalent it became like a part of our daily lives. I mean, I started using social media about 9, I guess. I don't know about you.
I started more recently, but I was kind of sheltered from it when I was younger. And as soon as I got access, I did start downloading apps that would allow me to be in more contact with people my age.
I was also pretty sheltered, and I would use my computer mainly. And then once I got a phone, I like instantly downloaded every major app I could. my mom's in the back there shaking her head.
How old were you when you got your phone?
So I had first gotten the phone at 6 years old, but I couldn't really do much with it.
It was a watch.
It was not a watch, it was an actual phone. It was an iPhone 5, I remember that. It was your old phone, you gave it to me. Anyway, I predominantly used my computer up until about the age of like 12, 13 maybe. I'm not really sure on the exact time range when I first got like my actual phone and the one I use today.
When you were 14 and you said you're the oldest person and you're agreeing with that one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I remember that. How much did you get your phone? So I didn't have like kind of an on and off phone thing. I got my first like access to the internet with a computer when I started middle school, and then during 7th grade and all the COVID lockdowns, I got a phone that I then broke, and I didn't get another phone until the start of 8th grade.
Yeah, honestly,
So 2021.
Speaking of COVID, I think that's like severely stunted adolescents today. Yeah, I do think so. I feel like I've got a friend who's a 6th grade teacher, and he'll talk about how these kids just missed this like social milestone during COVID due to their completely unrestricted access to the internet at a very young age. That they have things like fighting teachers and just talking back constantly.
There was a kid in my class, Josh, he does know. He bought a sub recently. And he got slapped with a gag notice for it.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the most significant things that I've noticed, especially in my own life, that may not apply to everybody, is parasocial relationships and alternate means of socializing. Because I also got access to the internet and social media in my teens when I was like coming out of middle school and into high school. But the thing that I noticed about myself is that rather than spending time socializing with a lot of my peers in school, I spent maybe the majority of that socialization time consuming media from online, social media producers. And it really felt to me at the time as if I had some type of a connection, like that social relationship to these people. And it took a while to realize you don't. The only relationship you have is that of a consumer to a producer. There's no actual friendship, no relationship there. So I think that's something that a lot of young people are experiencing more and more because they have so much greater and easier access to these social media personalities online than they necessarily do to even their peers. And even socializing with their peers over the internet is different from in-person socialization.
I think that's an interesting observation, and I think it's something that sort of speaks to an interesting kind of culture shift in between the generations represented here. The rise of influencers, that relationship to consumers, which I'm assuming were influencers big when you were growing up?
I would
Certainly not as
say,
big as they are now.
right, I would say around like high school, but I was also sheltered from social media, so I kind of like start to that.
And I guess we should offer a little bit of perspective, because that's one of the assumptions here. And this is something that I thought would be important to talk about, is the rise of social media influencers, which has really become like, it's an industry now, in terms of personalities, people who develop, a personality or a profile or a presence online. It could be fashion, it could be sports, it could be food and cooking, it could be health, it could be a range of things, right? But it's this idea that they emerge as, in some ways, as the word suggests, influences in terms of shaping people's consumer behavior, shaping their own sort of personal aspirations, their own sort of health aspirations, et cetera. I don't know if you want to add anything else about influencers, but it seems to me right that it might be interesting if you have some perspective on influencers in the sort of health and well-being space. I know there are a number of influencers who are advocating mental health and advocating being much more active and open about mental health issues, and therefore creating communities and facilitating conversations that in some ways I think have fundamentally transformed how young people both think and talk about mental health today. And some of that I think can be attributed to the impact and rise of social media. I know I think your hand was up, and then I think there's a hand in the corner. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just like back to the effects of social media. I know one place in like college area now, struggling with attention. Our attention spans are really short. Like we're watching TikTok videos are really short, or like multitasking, like eating food and like watching a show and then like texting on your phone like all at the same time. So it's like hard to sit through that's long, and that we were introduced to like the age of media later on. So I can't imagine kids that are kind of that's like iPad babies, how that's gonna be when they get older.
What's interesting to that point, just from like a brain perspective, is I don't know if y'all remember the app Vine. It lasted until like maybe like 2014 or something around there. But what made that app so perfect and why it grabbed our attention was because our brains are attenuated to or fixated to a sort of like video stimulus only for like a short period of time that extends between 0.5 to 3 seconds. In that time frame, you decide whether or not you're going to like the photo or dislike the video or move on to the next one. That's what made Vine so perfect. But like you said, from a development standpoint, that can be really detrimental for children in their focus in school and otherwise.
Yeah, I'm a parent of 2 teenagers, and influencers are concerned, and then I'm thankful for them and I'm not thankful. Some influencers have taught my kids about history while doing their makeup, which is really cool. They like sit there for hours. You're nodding. I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Other influencers, though, they go like skydiving one day and Paris the next day, and it's so unrealistic. When teenagers don't have access to that kind of money, that kind of time, and so it sets up like an unrealistic life. So I'd like to get the perspective.
I was actually going to go back to what you were saying about, like you briefly mentioned like the self-help space, and I've seen, especially in young boys, because it's kind of our demographic. I've seen the huge rise of like toxic self-help with, I'm sure y'all know, Andrew Tate, for example. A lot of head nods there.
No, I don't know about that. What is
You don't know Andrew Tate?
You don't want to know him.
Honestly, I don't think you really need
You don't want to know him.
He's like a hyper misogynist. He's basically just the embodiment of toxic masculinity. Like he's advocating, you know. I don't even need to get into this. He's not a great guy. And I've seen, you know, a lot of my friends like fall into him, and also with other sort of these hyper masculine self-help YouTubers. I don't know. Overall, I just think it's a very toxic space, and yeah, I fell into it myself.
So I wanted to say on influencers, I see the benefit and the negative sides kind of going off what you said, like for the mental health stuff, at least in college, that I've seen other college students that are influencers my age talking about how they've gotten help and even talking about different medications they take and that type of thing and how it's affected them. I think that's really helpful, but then we also fall into the negative space, like the toxic masculinity, but also when it comes to like misinformation about healthcare as well, that I think can be really dangerous, and even just about body image and stuff like that. There's a lot of influencers that are all day, like what I eat in my day is just a coffee and some green powder. Like that's not something that young kids need to be learning as like nutritional for them. It's not like just being constantly exposed to it is really helpful.
You raised two points that I'd love to get a perspective on from here and out in the audience as well. But those being this sort of social media sort of facilitated conversation in the community around mental health and mental well-being. Would love to get some perspective there. And then this other issue as it relates to influencers specifically, but I think also as it relates to social media more broadly speaking, with all topics, but obviously right with the topic at hand here, health, and that is right the concern around misinformation, disinformation. You know, how do we help young people develop the skills to be able to discern, right, the credibility of a source and what it's suggesting, advocating, or recommending in general. But again, you know, given the sort of urgency and the significance of health, you know, misinformation and disinformation can be quite significant. So think about COVID and a lot of misinformation about vaccines, for example, discouraging people from taking vaccines for reasons that just simply weren't evidence-based, weren't scientific, but were really more political, ideological, et cetera. So those are sort of two broad areas that we might want to spend some time talking about. I'd love to hear from those of you on the panel your thoughts about the kinds of conversations and communities that are circulating via social media around.
I think that there are some benefits of social media, such as finding a community with those illnesses, such as depression, anxiety, stress, and stuff like that. But there are also some challenges, such as self-isolation, not physically seeking them, but seeking them online. And also, like what you said, misinformation. Sometimes they could also be promoting more harm than good.
Kind of on that misinformation of wellness point, I think you mentioned on like, I was assuming you're referring to influencers on TikTok, like promoting these like outlandish health products and reality do nothing for you. We kind of see influencers using their platform to obviously extend some sort of like monetary agenda, like, and they're promoting these like wellness powders and vitamins and creams and so forth. But in reality, it could be misinformation that can actually not work. So that's kind of another perspective.
Any interesting trends among you and your peers around? Just curious in terms of what your peers or others maybe are saying about mental health. What's the sort of perspective?
I'd say depression is a huge issue. Everybody I know is depressed. I mean, we were both depressed at a point. Like every single teen today is depressed at, you know, some point or another in their life. I don't know if that's the same with like college students, but it's
Some of you may have seen, right, the Surgeon General, right? I think I saw this in the New York Times yesterday. He's actually trying to make this a national priority. Right? He's saying that we are in a adolescent, teen, young people mental health crisis. That this country really needs to sort of accelerate efforts to address this because it is a problem. And so I think you're exactly right. If the Surgeon General was sitting here, he would absolutely.
Kind of just 2 points. One is I don't know if you would give necessarily credit to social media in your opinion as opposed to like your school environment. But I feel like when I was in high school, I couldn't think of a guy that would like talk about depression, let alone like kind of this openness with it. So one of my questions is like, did you see that in school in addition to like seeing it on social media, or did you feel like it was just on social media that you were exposed to that? And my other question is kind of, you mentioned you were the last 14-year-old to get your phone, and I kind of I wonder if there's this need of like, okay, there's good and bad, and we can't decipher, so we should just not be on it. Is that a realistic option at all?
So to answer the last part of your question, today, at least in high school, it is completely impossible to get through.
Suicide, yeah.
Well, not even social suicide. It is impossible to get through most of your classes without a cell phone. It is, your teachers will have you look things up on your phone, scan things, use it as a calculator, many different uses. And then for your first question, you asked if you see it not only on social media, but also in school. I'm not sure what it comes from because it was actually a pretty drastic change from, leaving school in 6th grade because of COVID when everything was still very shut off, and coming back in 8th grade when someone would tell you kind of their deepest secret, just like a 5-minute conversation about like their mental health, their struggle, their trauma. So I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's definitely very open in schools. So.
I think social media has helped that, but I think it's also the cause.
That's a really profound observation.
I had a question about sort of like the toxic masculinity or like, the things that influencers are talking about in the mental health space or just physical health. When you come across those things, is the conversation more like, wow, this is so ridiculous, or is there still that subset of like, maybe this is believable and this is like what we should do?
So I can't speak for all people, but I found that very few guys will talk about it in person, but instead they'll more propagate these like very sort of echo chamber groups online. It's the only place to talk about it because it's still really frowned upon to like fate. It's also kind of social suicide. Yeah. And I don't think guys are open about it, but I do think it greatly affects them.
I think that's true. I'm kind of just going to add on to what you said. If you were to kind of like show one of these like videos of one of these super misogynistic, toxic masculinity videos in like, let's say my school, you would immediately get people that are like telling you why it's wrong. And I think something that's kind of difficult for like a lot of people my age and a lot of different ages to understand is that, again, kids our age aren't really great at being told like what they're believing is wrong, like wholly. So if you tell them that, they're more likely to just do what he said, like kind of go in and just go into one of these platforms where everyone's going to agree with them and just sit there and stew and get worse.
No. Okay.
So nowadays you see doctors on TikTok and they have millions of followers. This is a question for the younger group, do you see that as credible, or do you question it because they are on a platform like TikTok?
I'd say it's honestly pretty credible. Like I found they do provide quality advice, and a lot of the time I'll actually see them debunking like bad things. I don't use TikTok very much. You can speak more to that. I'm an Instagram guy.
Use Instagram more. I use TikTok more, but I can say that I agree with him. But it does depend. I will usually, before like I follow someone or I believe what they say, I'll like take some of the things they say on their account and I'll just like kind of run it through like Google. I'll just look it up, see if it's credible, see what they're saying. Sometimes they'll even like post their medical credentials on their like website. You'll get to go look at their website, see their practice, and after that, I'll usually leave it.
To be fair, I do think you're kind of a unique case.
Yeah. And what you just articulated, right? So I and some of my colleagues and others too have studied what we might call digital literacy, right? And that is really developing the range of skills or competencies to sort of navigate these systems in a much more effective way. And what you just described is a perfect illustration of that. So you see something, right? But then how do you fact check? How do you probe? How do you ensure that this is credible information, a credible resource? That's a skill, right? And it's a skill right offline, but given that so much of our engagement and younger people's engagement with information around it is now being facilitated via online, is how do you sort of translate those skills for the digital world and digital environment? That's a great example. I wish that more people would like that, but I think I agree with you that you I won't say you're an outlier, but probably a very small percentage of young people have the capacity to do that. And I think for educators in the room, healthcare professionals in the room, this is really something to perhaps engage youth-based populations that you work with or serve, to really sort of emphasize, right, helping them to develop those repertoire of skills that might allow them to sort of navigate these minefields that are constantly popping up as they make their way through the social media landscape. I think you had an observation or a question?
My observation is I feel like we all have this predisposed notion of like what steers us into the type of social media that we consume, but sometimes we like get into this black hole of how did I get here? And I think most of the issues caused on social media are basically media that is A versus B. So for example, it's usually in this sense we're just talking about the genders of female and male. Like females are being seen as hyper independent men. They can also do the same things that they do. They have higher expectations if they are looking for a male partner. And then men are feeling like they are being attacked because they have values from a misogynistic perspective. And I think some men, and they didn't feel like that originally, but then they start to feel like, well, you know what, like he sounds right. Yeah. Instead of saying, why is he saying those things? Is he correct? The more you consume it, the more you start to think that. Even A versus B, being healthy versus unhealthy. Well, this person is taking all these vitamins and they're doing all these green colors. And how are they finding the time to cook so much protein throughout the day? I mean, I work 8 hours a day and I barely have time to feed myself lunch. Even if I take the time to meal prep, or even if I'm too tired, I'm like, I'll just take out. So it almost sets you up for failure to feed into your insecurities, because you're like, I want to live this lifestyle. I think they're also right in what they're saying, but how do I embody it best? So it's just an observation I had.
Yeah, and I think it's an excellent observation, and you articulated, I think, some really interesting dilemmas, right? That are very much, I think, a kind of essential part of this broader kind of social media culture and experience that we're discussing.
Even race issues. People have accounts where they share accurate information about racial history, and other people automatically feel attacked. Like, well, that was then, not us now. Why are you still bringing this up? Like, it's just causing more racial issues. Why can't we see everyone as equal when it's okay to have an acknowledgement of this history and embrace it, and also because we want a better community in the future. So it's always like A versus B.
Now, one of the points that was made that I found really profound, and was your observation, is that on the one hand, social media has created a space for people to talk more openly about mental health, for example, to share stories, to share interventions and solutions. I think really just to sort of to build a vocabulary and a language to talk about this in a way that a generation, certainly 2 or 3 generations ago, that vocabulary just didn't exist, right? There was no language. For example, maybe when I was growing up in the 80s, to talk about mental health, for instance. And I think in some ways social media has sort of transformed that now, right? And given young people, right, the vocabulary, the language, the community in which they can begin to express, right, what they're feeling and what they're going through. But then you also said that on the flip side of that, right, there's obviously, right, a lot of anxiety about the extent to which social media sort of drives mental unwellness, right? And obviously, right, a lot of the revelations about Facebook and, what it's known for years about Instagram and its social channels and what that's meant to adolescents and their mental health and how they had kind of swept a lot of that under the rug or weren't really, vigilant about trying to address that. So there's this tension, right, between on the one hand, a platform or a tool that's kind of created, right, community conversation, vocabulary, and a way to begin to talk about this in a way that to your points here, this just wouldn't have been possible, just a generation ago. But on the flip side of that, right, there's also, right, this anxiety about what it's doing in terms of a lot of the examples that have been given here, right, people posing on social media, people presenting, right, a certain kind of happy lifestyle or a fantastic lifestyle that other people maybe can't access, and therefore creating, right, that kind of disconnect, in some ways creating, right, a sense of failure or a sense of self-disappointment and self-degradation. So there are all of these things that are sort of implicated in this technology. So I think the point here, right, is that we have to be very careful in terms of trying to understand this, right, the sort of the gray shades as opposed to either black or either white in terms of what's happening here.
And I think one of the big things on health specifically is that we're bombarded with a lot of information. And even for those of us who might have the willingness to fact check it, if we spend our time to fact check every piece of information that we get, we'll never have time for anything else. So it really becomes a question of how do you curate these trusted sources of information? How do you figure out if a source of information is trustworthy and continue to reevaluate that over time? Because for those of you who have been in college and maybe taken courses on how to do effective research, it's like that's a powerful skill that most people do not have if they don't have that kind of background in literacy on these topics to recognize trustworthy sources and good research. Everyone else just kind of has to trust what they hear.
Questions? There's like different generations up there, but I lived a significant part of my life pre-social media, pre-internet. Sometimes I look at social media as like Pandora's box. Like once it's opened, like you got everything, the good and the bad, and you put it back in. What would you three, like for myself, I would put social media back in there. Again, that's just my opinion. I have reasons for that. Mental health being there's a bunch of other things. But there's great things about social media, of course. But my question for like different generations, how do you feel about that? And if you keep it open, I'm just gonna assume you're biased because you love likes and views stuff. But no, really.
I would absolutely put it back in. Like, I think it's the worst possible thing, like for teens today. Honestly, I'd say it's very little good. It's like 90-10. Personally, I just think it's really bad, and I would absolutely put it back in a heartbeat.
I would say the same. I remember being like 12 and 13 and wanting, well, I guess not that young, more like 15, 16. And my parents would not let me get Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook or anything. And I just felt so left out, but dang, my grades were good, right? But anyway, but I think getting the thing that I wanted so badly just set me up, can set anyone up for failure when it comes to social media, because there's just so many unrealistic expectations, comparison. It takes your time and attention away from other things you could be doing, like going for a walk or enjoying lunch with a friend. And I think it's really profound that like y'all's generation recognizes that, ours does, and I assume yours does. So
we don't have.
I totally agree with it. But I do think that there are some good points because there is still like a stigma on mental health. I think that it doesn't allow for like the community to be able to talk sometimes. it is hard to talk directly with people that you know because it might also affect them. Like your problems might hurt them as well. I think there are some good parts, but yeah, I agree. I would close it back to, but we can't. So.
I would like to add on to that. I would appreciate it if like everybody, didn't use anything like that. But I do agree that there are definitely some parts that are beneficial. Like we mentioned earlier, like the inclusivity in schools is just way beyond a level that it could have been even 5 years ago. And for the most part, that is because of social media.
Is there any way we could have the good parts without the bad?
That's possible.
Honestly, I think we should just capitalize on the good things because we all know there's no putting it back. So,
And I think, I mean, a lot of the major tech platforms are trying to figure that out, right? So can they engineer a system that can filter out quote unquote bad stuff and sort of prioritize quote unquote the good stuff? We'll see, right? So far, not very successful, but it doesn't mean that they won't keep trying.
So question for all of them. So if you were a parent, what would be the age that would leave your child?
Answer carefully.
oh god. Arguably, again, like as I mentioned earlier, I mean, you get like very heavy FOMO if you don't have a phone. Because everybody has a phone as early as 7th grade, maybe. So even 6th grade, yeah, almost like half of the people there, at least in my middle school, had phones.
And now it's probably
even higher. So I've seen kids as young as like 7 and 8 get phones. I've seen like 9-year-olds who vape. That's a whole other issue.
So imagine you guys, I want to hear each one of you.
Yeah, you're the parent. What's your answer?
What is your answer as a parent? Knowing your experience.
He's more mature than me, you should ask him.
Very good way.
Come on, Isaac, go for it.
I think that he raised some good points about the fact that I don't think you will get shunned, but I do agree that it will be much harder to fit in if you can use social media. But I do think that it's the parents' responsibility to make sure they have talks with their child about appropriate use of social media, appropriate the things that you should be doing on it, the things you shouldn't be doing on it. And if it comes down to it, maybe even restrictions on what your child can view on social media.
I think it's interesting what she said, because I have a 13 and a 14-year-old. And I pretty much hear this every day. Oh, my friend has Snapchat. When is mine? I said, you're not going to have access to Snapchat, right?
I definitely would say, to add on to y'all's point, like I also experienced FOMO because I didn't have my phone and I couldn't have social media, but I think that, as you guys said, it's a parent's responsibility to have those conversations with their child. I had the rule up until I was 18, I had to put my phone away at 8 p.m. Because past 8 p.m. was dinner, sleep, homework, and I could do my homework on my laptop. I could even text my friends from my laptop if I wanted to, but having that discipline to put away the screen could improve your sleep, low exposure to blue lights. You won't be so focused on those notifications. And just making sure that your child can have that understanding that it's good for their health. It's not because you don't want them to have friends. It's not because you don't want them to be a social outcast. It's genuinely for their mental and actually physical health.
I would like to add on to something. Not all social medias are created equal. There are definitely some that have more
negative
impact.
I think they all have like their own negative impacts on their own way. Like TikTok, for example, greatly decreases attention spans. Instagram, like body image.
Snapchat's where old people trying to talk to you and send you things that you can't unsee.
Do you have a response to the suggestion to parents, or if you were parents?
If I was a parent, I feel like by the time that we're parents, the age might be even lower. I feel like 2-year-old. I feel like maybe, I don't know, I feel like I wouldn't know right now, but I feel like I would trust my child and, put boundaries there in place. And just like sit down and have a talk with them, like, hey, this is what you should go on social media to do, and this is what you shouldn't do. Like you shouldn't go there to see like realistic expectations. But you could go there to like meet people and stuff like that. So I don't know, but I think like you're doing good.
As a senior citizen on the panel, I've been around long enough and have, both as a parent, I have a 22-year-old daughter, and then as a researcher, have sort of seen this space and these kinds of questions evolve significantly. So I can remember a question being shifting from should, as a parent, should I get my child a phone, to when I should get my child a phone.
And then the social media.
And I think we're there now. But I think they all make really excellent points, and my wife and I experienced this with our daughter. There does become a point where the phone is pretty critical to not only their social life, but in some ways even really their academic life. I can remember instances like where my daughter, if she or a friend, forgot to bring a textbook or a homework assignment home, they could take a picture of it with their phone and text it to their friends. And I saw them doing this all the time. And so in that sense, right, they were using it, right, to sort of support their academic endeavors. The point being, right, and you're exactly right, the age is trickling down to younger and younger and younger. The truth is, right, 1 and 2-year-olds are now exposed to YouTube. I mean, I was blown away when I had a meeting with some folks on YouTube about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But 2 and 3-year-old children have their own subscribed channels right now. And so that's how young children are getting introduced to these technologies. There was a piece in the New York Times today about ChatGPT, kids, and families. I mentioned that in part because it's a good article, but also because I'm quoted in the article. But the piece is really about what are the concerns and risks that parents should be aware of as it relates to systems like ChatGPT and just the acceleration of these platforms, and really, right, the deeper intrusion of AI-based systems into the lives of younger and younger children. And part of what I advocate, right, is that we as adults, educators, parents, healthcare professionals, but I think we are increasingly required to have these conversations, with young people, to talk with them about how these systems work, the benefits, but also some of the concerns about them, how a lot of them function primarily, right, as data gathering sort of machines. It's really about, identifying you, profiling you, your behavior, what you like, what you dislike, what you respond to, and then tuning the algorithm, right, to respond to that. And because we're introducing our kids at younger and younger ages to these technologies, we really need to figure out a way to start having conversations with them at younger and younger ages about these kinds of things. And so the landscape is changing significantly, pretty quickly now. And I agree with you, right? It's not improbable that in the next 5 to 10 years, 4 or 5 and 6-year-old kids will likely have their own devices. I mean, I think that's already happening. It'll be the norm, right, in a relatively short period of time.
Let's have one more question.
Okay, I think one more question, and then.
I, as a parent of a 22-year-old and a 16-year-old, one of the things is I want to expose them because they need to use critical thinking. They're out in the world. My kid is in England right now going to college and is going to be experiencing things. And so I'd rather them talk to me and kind of work through some of the decisions around whether this is good or bad. They have already learned some terrible lessons in social media that have caused us to shut it down. But it's almost like it's not just about your phone. Now you're going onto smart televisions and you have access to all these different channels, right? Or you go to, or you're at friends' homes. And so they still have to figure out how they're going to navigate what to look at and what not to look at, what to believe.
I'd say, honestly, it doesn't really matter what parents say. Because we're teenagers, y'all are all going to be losers to us. It doesn't matter what you say. I don't think you can really have conversations with your teenager and have them take it apart. The best thing you can sort of do is just build up trust with them to the point where they feel like talking to you. And again, I think the best thing you can do is honestly just restrict their time. Not like a bunch, but I'd say until about mom look at you until 9:30. I'm just saying. Until I fall asleep.
Mom's shaking her head like, no way. So I think we're at time. I want to say thank you so much for this panel. Thank you for the youth experts here. I really love people putting these events together and inviting people to be a part of the conversation and to shape the conversation. So you missed a really great conversation.
You all are so amazing.
Aren't they?
I have never met.
I felt dumb.
I've never met. Not yet. I've never met more eloquent freshman. My brother's a senior. He's nowhere as well. So I can sit. Whatever y'all do, keep it up.